In 1965, a song came out of Britain that made parents wince and teenagers turn the volume up as high as it would go. The BBC refused to play it. Respectable people wanted it gone, and nobody could stop it. This is the story of the 1965 song parents wanted gone. But teenagers couldn't stop playing. A band that wasn't supposed to last. Before my generation existed, there was very little reason to believe The Who would amount to anything lasting. They had formed in London in 1964, emerging from the northwest part of the city under the name The Detours, before settling on their eventual name. A name suggested, according to band lore, by Townshend's roommate Richard Barnes, and confirmed by Daltrey as the best of several options. Guitarist Pete Townshend, singer Roger Daltrey, bassist John Entwistle, and drummer Keith Moon were young, working class, and not particularly polished. Their early sound was built on American rhythm and blues covers, and by the time their first single, I Can't Explain, appeared in January 1965, a song Townshend had deliberately written to sound like the Kinks, who were produced by the same man, Shel Talmy. Even the people managing them were not sure the band would survive long enough to release a second one. Townshend himself recalled in a 1987 interview with Rolling Stone that when My Generation was being written and recorded, there was a general feeling that the band's career would be incredibly brief. He was 20 years old and genuinely uncertain about where the band was headed, telling the interviewer that he had been very, very lost during that period. The Who had already gone through a period of being rebranded as the High Numbers, a name chosen for them by a mod publicist named Peter Meaden, who wanted to position them more precisely within London's mod scene, and who briefly restyled their look and sound to match. When that didn't fully take hold commercially, managers Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp stepped in, helped restore the original name, and began steering the band towards something more aggressively confrontational than what Meaden had envisioned. Lambert and Stamp were an unusual pairing. Lambert came from a privileged background and had film industry connections. Stamp was the brother of actor Terence Stamp and came from a very different social world. Together, they pushed The Who toward a harder-edged identity rooted in the mod scene, but reaching beyond it, and they developed a promotional strategy they called auto-destruction. The idea that the band would smash their equipment at the end of performances as a deliberate artistic statement rather than a random act of chaos. Townshend had begun smashing guitars after accidentally breaking one by driving its neck through a low ceiling at a club in Harrow in 1964. And when the audience reacted enthusiastically, the practice had been deliberately continued. By 1965, it was a signature element of the band's live shows, and it gave them a reputation for destruction that preceded them wherever they performed. The mod subculture that Lambert and Stamp were working with was itself a product of a specific post-war moment in Britain. These were young people, primarily working class, primarily urban, who had no memory of World War II at all and no particular loyalty to the social frameworks their parents had built around the experience of surviving it. Townshend, who was born just a week after Nazi Germany's surrender in May 1945, was in that exact cohort. The first generation for whom the war was not a shaping experience, but a background fact, something that belonged entirely to the world of their parents and grandparents. Mods dressed sharply, rode scooters, took amphetamines on weekends, and danced at clubs. They had nothing in common with the establishment that their elders respected and deferred to, and they were entirely uninterested in pretending otherwise. What the band needed, by the middle of 1965, was a song that said all of that, plainly, loudly, and without apology. Written on a birthday, sparked by a hearse. Pete Townshend wrote My Generation on May 19, 1965, his 20th birthday, on a train ride from London to Southampton. The song emerged partly from a specific and somewhat absurd piece of personal grievance that had been sitting with him for some time. Townshend owned a 1935 Packard hearse that he used to get around London, a vehicle he had bought for £30 and which he parked in various parts of the city while he went about his daily business. One day, he came back to where he had parked it and found it gone. It had been towed on the orders of the Queen Mother, who had reportedly asked to have the vehicle removed because it reminded her of her late husband's funeral. A similar vehicle had been used to transport his remains, and it was, apparently, parked somewhere she found it distressing to look at. When Townshend went to collect it, the retrieval fee was £250. He had paid $30 for the hearse in the first place. He told Q magazine the story years later, still finding it absurd. That fury fed directly into the song. Townshend has said the famous lyric about hoping to die before getting old was partly rooted in his reaction to the Queen Mother's intervention. Not a literal death wish, but a rejection of what that kind of authority represented. He later explained that, in his mind at the time, old was essentially synonymous with rich and powerful. The kind of people who could have a young man's car towed simply because looking at it made them uncomfortable, without apology or consequence, with no mechanism by which the young man could push back. He had also been carrying the influence of Mose Allison's Young Man Blues in his head for some time, and acknowledged directly that without Allison, My Generation would not have existed in the form it took. The song began as a slow, stark blues number, closer to a Jimmy Reed influence in its earliest draft, and it took months and multiple recorded attempts before it became the urgent, frantic piece of music that wound up on the radio. Co-manager Chris Stamp later recalled that it took him nearly 2 months to convince the rest of the band that the song was worth recording at all. Daltrey was uncertain about it in its early form, and the group had to be sold on its potential. Townshend himself went through several complete sets of lyrics and recorded at least 3 very different demos of the song across the summer of 1965, working on it during tour stretches through Scandinavia and the Netherlands, refining it slowly and without any certainty that it would amount to anything. Recording it, breaking it, finishing it. The definitive recording session took place on October 13, 1965, at IBC Studios in London's Portland Place, with American producer Shel Talmy behind the boards. Talmy had already worked with the Kinks. He had produced You Really Got Me, which had come out the year before and which shared a certain structural DNA with what The Who were building. And he understood how to capture raw, aggressive rock and roll on tape without smoothing the edges off it. The song was also notable for another technical element. It modulates through multiple keys during its runtime, shifting from G up through A and B flat to C, giving it a feeling of forward momentum that matches the urgency in the vocal performance. Townshend's guitars were tuned down a full step for the recording, giving the bottom end an additional heaviness that suited the song's confrontational tone. 2 things happened in that studio that made the final recording what it became. The first was the stutter. The band had attempted the song without it in earlier sessions. Daltrey himself has confirmed he had a real stutter as a young man, that he had trained himself to control. But in the studio that day, manager Kit Lambert told him to stutter the words, to sound, as Lambert put it, like a British kid who was high on amphetamines and trying to explain himself. Daltrey later recalled the exchange with amusement, telling Uncut magazine that he responded by pointing out that he was in that condition at the time. Lambert's direction also drew on the precedent of John Lee Hooker's Stuttering Blues, which the management team had been studying as a model for how the effect could work in a rock and roll context. The stutter transformed the song. It made the narrator sound not just angry, but inarticulate with anger, unable to express the full weight of what he felt, the frustration spilling out through the broken rhythm of the words themselves. Talmy later recalled that the moment the stutter locked into place in the vocal performance, he knew immediately they had something extraordinary. He described the session as one of those rare studio moments when everyone in the room can feel that a recording is capturing exactly what a song was always supposed to be. The second was John Entwistle's bass. Entwistle was widely considered one of the most technically accomplished bass players in rock music, and what he contributed to My Generation was something that had almost no precedent in the form at the time. A genuine bass solo, running through the song's instrumental break, played on a Dane electro bass guitar. He broke multiple strings during the recording session trying to nail it, forcing the session to pause repeatedly while equipment was replaced. The song's structure sets up this moment through a call-and-response dynamic between Townshend's guitar and Entwistle's bass, with the solo emphasis passing between them multiple times before the bass takes the lead entirely. What Entwistle finally captured, once the take came together, was the first major bass solo in rock and roll history. A moment in which the instrument that had always stayed in the background stepped forward and functioned as the lead voice in the room. The song then ends, not with a fade or a clean resolution, but with a collapse of guitar feedback from Townshend's Rickenbacker, the music disintegrating rather than concluding, which suited the song's energy perfectly. The BBC said no. The teenagers said otherwise. My Generation was released as a single on October 29, 1965. Almost immediately, the BBC refused to add it to their rotation. The stated reason was that Roger Daltrey's vocal stutter might cause offense to listeners who themselves had a stutter, a concern that, in retrospect, tells you quite a lot about the priorities of British broadcasting at the time and the culture of institutional caution that governed it. There were no guidelines being invoked against youth frustration, implied drug use, or the barely concealed profanity of the song's "F5 Fade Away" refrain. There was, apparently, a written standard protecting the sensitivities of stutter sufferers, and the BBC leaned on it firmly. The band didn't hold for long because it couldn't. The song was already being played everywhere else it could reach, pirate radio stations operating off the coast of Britain, which had been broadcasting to British teenagers since 1964, from ships anchored just outside territorial waters to avoid regulation, had no such restrictions, and played whatever their audiences demanded. Jukeboxes in mod clubs across London and in cities throughout Britain were getting a constant workout. The demand for the record was immediate and unstoppable, and by the time the BBC reversed its position and added the song to rotation, the record had already built its own momentum entirely, without the help of the most powerful broadcaster in the country. By late November and into December 1965, My Generation had climbed to number 2 on the UK singles chart, the highest the band would ever chart in their home country, a position they tied only once more, with I'm a Boy in 1966. It was kept off the top spot by a recording by Cliff Richard, who represented almost everything the song was pushing back against: clean, establishment-approved, parent-friendly British pop, the acceptable face of youth culture that parents could actually appreciate. The contrast between the two records sitting side by side at the top of the British charts in December 1965 was almost too neat a piece of cultural symbolism to have been planned. In the United States, the story was different. The song was issued there in November 1965 on the Decca label, and it reached only number 74 on the Billboard Hot 100, briefly appearing before fading without making a significant commercial impression. American teenagers of 1965 were not yet fully primed for the Who's specific brand of controlled aggression. That would come in subsequent years, as the band built their American reputation through increasingly explosive live performances, and as the counterculture that would carry the song's spirit into the rest of the decade began to take shape across the Atlantic. The instrument destruction, the explosion, the hearing loss. By 1967, My Generation was already the song that defined The Who on stage, and performing it had become something close to a ritual of destruction. Townshend's practice of smashing his guitar at the end of live performances had become famous across Britain and was beginning to reach American audiences, who were encountering it for the first time in person as the band toured the United States. The moment that made My Generation permanently part of American cultural memory came on September 17, 1967, when The Who appeared on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, the CBS television program. That was at that point one of the few places on American network television willing to book acts that made the establishment uncomfortable. The show's hosts, Tom and Dick Smothers, had been told The Who would destroy their instruments at the end of the set. What nobody had been specifically told was what Keith Moon had arranged behind the scenes. Moon had persuaded the show's pyrotechnics operator to place an explosive charge inside his bass drum, a device he had apparently been using at the end of some live shows to punctuate the instrument destruction. For the television taping on September 15th, however, things escalated beyond what anyone had planned. A charge had been placed in the drum during soundcheck and not detonated. Moon then added more explosives himself, apparently unaware of what was already there. The stage manager, who had been complying with Moon's requests, also added more without realizing the accumulation. When the charge went off at the end of the performance, it was carrying roughly 3 times the explosive force anyone had intended. The blast sent shrapnel from a shattered cymbal into Moon's arm. A piece of the drum kit hit Townshend in the head and set his hair alight. Smoke filled the stage. Roger Daltrey came to check on Moon, while Pete Townshend stood in the wreckage. Townshend, still dazed, then grabbed a guitar belonging to Tom Smothers, who had come over to try to wrap up the segment, and smashed that as well. Actress Bette Davis, who was backstage waiting for her own segment, reportedly fainted at the sound of the explosion. The broadcast was momentarily knocked off the air. Townshend has consistently said that his hearing was permanently damaged by the explosion on the Smothers Brothers stage, though some accounts suggest that The Who's use of extraordinarily high-volume amplifier stacks over years of touring also contributed substantially to the hearing loss he has lived with since. Either way, the performance became one of the most talked-about moments in early American rock television history. And it was My Generation, the song that parents had wanted gone 2 years earlier, that provided the backdrop for all of it. What it left behind. My Generation was ranked number 11 on Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time, in both the 2004 and 2010 editions of that list, a position that placed it ahead of the overwhelming majority of what popular music had produced in the preceding century. It was included in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 Songs That Shaped Rock and Roll, and was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame for being, in the organization's own citation, historical, artistic, and significant. NME, reviewing it in 2015, awarded it 10 points out of 10 and described it as a recording that had encapsulated the angst of being a teenager in a way no previous song had managed. The Cashbox Trade magazine, at the time of its original release in 1965, had described it as a rollicking, blues-drenched handclapper, which says that today's kids have more rights than their elders think. Both assessments, separated by half a century, were pointing at the same thing. The legacy of the line about hoping to die before getting old became one of the more complicated discussions in rock and roll history, because the 4 people who recorded the song in 1965 aged at very different rates and in very different directions. John Entwistle, the bassist who had played what was effectively the song's most technically groundbreaking moment, died of a heart attack caused by cocaine use in June 2002 at the age of 57, the night before a Who tour was set to begin in Las Vegas. He was found in his hotel room at the Hard Rock Hotel. The tour went ahead. Keith Moon, the drummer whose explosive personality and physical drumming style helped define what the song sounded like on stage and whose name had become synonymous with rock and roll chaos and excess, died in September 1978 at the age of 32, of an accidental overdose of clomethiazole, a sedative that had been prescribed to help him manage alcohol withdrawal. He had taken 32 of the tablets, the maximum prescribed dosage, across the course of the night. He was, of all the members of the band, the one who came closest to living the literal meaning of the most famous line they had ever recorded. Roger Daltrey, when the inevitable questions about that line were put to him as he aged through his 30s and 40s and beyond, answered consistently and with evident patience that it was about an attitude rather than a physical age, about refusing to become rigid, comfortable, and closed to new experience, regardless of how old the calendar said you were. He has continued performing the song into his 80s, delivering it with a conviction that has never fully dimmed. Townshend himself has said in multiple interviews that "My generation" was always, at its core, about trying to find a place in society, the anger of a generation that didn't yet know where it fit, expressed through the only medium available to them at the time. He described it in 1967, just 2 years after writing it, as the only really successful piece of social comment he had ever made. He was 22 years old when he said that, and had already written one of the 50 most significant songs in the history of popular music. It was the first song in rock and roll history to fully put that feeling into words. The feeling of being young, working class, and unwilling to sit quietly in the place the world had already decided you belonged. Parents wanted it gone. Teenagers couldn't stop playing it. And 60 years on, the song hasn't faded away. If this brought back the feeling of the first time you heard it, or if you learned something new about the story behind it, drop it in the comments. Hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.